The first scream didn't come from the cockpit. It tore out of the aisle. Boots hammered through the narrow cabin as three armed men surged forward, shouting in a language no one quite understood. Rifles swung freely, muzzles slicing past faces like silent accusations. A drink cart slammed sideways, spilling plastic cups and ice across the floor. A woman sobbed. Someone began praying out loud. The aircraft, calm seconds earlier, suddenly felt too cramped to breathe. Viktor Kovac stopped at the center of the cabin and seized the nearest flight attendant by the arm. Ellison didn't fight him. He drove her down between the seats, forcing her shoulder until her knees struck the carpet. His grip stayed firm as his voice remained flat, almost bored. While he explained that this was what happened to people who forgot their place, passengers stared, frozen. Some turned away, ashamed and relieved it wasn't them. Mara kept her eyes lowered. Her hands rested loosely on her thighs. She looked small, ordinary, broken, only. One man noticed what was wrong with that picture. Cole Barrett watched the way she settled her weight, the way her breathing slowed instead of spiking, the way her balance stayed flawless, even on her knees, as light turbulence rippled through the plane. Fear flooded the cabin. Judgment lingered thick in the air. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these real accounts of courage. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Mara Ellison was in her early 40s. The kind of woman most people looked through instead of at. Her hair was pinned neatly, her navy uniform pressed smooth. Her face arranged into that practiced airline calm that made strangers feel safe without ever demanding attention. She'd flown this route so many times she could picture the cabin with her eyes closed. The loose seatbelt over a toddler's lap in row 10. The man who always asked for 2 sugars, the first-time flyer gripping the armrest like a lifeline in her world. Comfort came from routine, and routine came from doing small things correctly. To the passengers, she was service a moving uniform, a polite voice that meant coffee, blankets, and rules about tray tables. Even now, as fear crept through the cabin like smoke, most of them still saw her as harmless, safely powerless. That was why Viktor Kovac chose her. He didn't just want control of the plane. He wanted control of the story unfolding inside it. And humiliating a flight attendant was the easiest way to teach. 200 people how to obey without resistance? Mara stayed on her knees until he released her. When he moved on, she rose slowly, as if drained of strength, as if there was nothing left to give. She walked the aisle with her head lowered, gathering spilled cups and straightening what she could not, just to help. But because it gave her a reason to move, it gave her angles, distances, faces. Time Senator Paul Whitmore sat near the front, shoulders stiff with outrage he couldn't use. He watched Mara the way some powerful men looked at staff when things went wrong, as if she were part of the failure, as if she should fix it simply because she wore a uniform. When she paused to check on a shaking woman, Whitmore leaned in and spoke just loud enough for her to hear. He told her she needed to be useful, that the crew had responsibilities, that someone should talk to the men and work this out. His words sounded brave. They were not. They carried contempt, wrapped in entitlement. Delivered like a complaint to customer service, Mara didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She gave him a small nod, the same one she'd used on angry travelers and exhausted. Family's 4 years and moved on. Behind her, Linda Moore watched closely. Linda was the senior attendant, mid-50s, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who could read a cabin like weather. Years of training new hires had taught her that panic always left traces. Even in people trying to hide it, Mara was leaving none. The hijackers paced the aisle, confiscating phones, checking overhead bins, barking orders that made grown men shrink. The lights felt too bright now, reflecting off sweat and tears. Even the engine hum sounded louder, as if the aircraft itself were listening. Mara moved through it with controlled steps. Her shoulders stayed level. Her breathing stayed slow. Her hands remained visible and empty. But her eyes didn't wander the way frightened eyes usually did. They tracked. Cole Barrett hadn't wanted an aisle seat, but it was the last one available. Now it gave him a clear view of everything that mattered. and his body had slipped back into old habits. 18 years in the Air Force didn't leave quietly. It lingered in instincts, watching hands, measuring spacing, listening for shifts in tone, assessing threats without drawing attention. He saw how Mara watched Viktor without staring, how she counted the men without moving her lips, how her gaze flicked to the cockpit door, then to the emergency phone, then to the bulkhead, as if mapping the cabin in her head. Asterisk. Most people stared at the weapons. Mara watched timing. When the plane hit rough air, the cabin jolted. Passengers gasped. A woman clutched her husband's wrist. A child whimpered. Mara adjusted her stance before the bump fully arrived. Just a subtle shift enough to keep her balanced without reaching for a seat. Cole had seen that reflex before. Flightline crews and pilots stepping off ladders in crosswinds. Linda saw it too. Their eyes met for half a second. What Linda saw there wasn't fear, it was calculation. Mara crouched beside an older man struggling to breathe, guiding him through slow breaths with a gentle voice. Her fingers found his wrist, checking his pulse like she was reading a gauge. Then she scanned the cabin again and moved on before anyone could thank her. It wasn't coldness. It was discipline. Cole felt something tighten in his gut, a familiarity he couldn't quite name. People cried softly, clung to one another, whispered prayers. Mara moved like someone who had accepted fear as a fact, not a crisis. She didn't look heroic. She looked determined to be forgettable. As she reached the galley curtain, Viktor's gaze followed her a moment too long. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. Mara returned with water bottles, passing them down the aisle with steady hands. Each stop added to her mental inventory Viktor, favoring his right side. The impulsive one constantly adjusting his grip, the technical one scanning the cabin like he was counting exits. Then her eyes flicked briefly toward the overhead speaker, not with fear, but the way someone listened for radio traffic. Her jaw tightened once, as if recognizing a voice from memory. Cole swallowed hard. He'd spent years around pilots. He knew the look of someone listening to a channel no one else could hear. Mara wore that same quiet readiness, like an internal checklist nearing completion. Linda stepped close in the galley and asked softly if she was okay. Mara nodded, told her to keep people calm, to keep the aisle clear. Routine instructions. Delivered without hesitation. Linda almost asked why she sounded so certain, then stopped as Viktor turned his head. Listening, Mara lowered her gaze again, shrinking back into expectation. The tired flight attendant, the background presence. But Cole knew better. Asterisk. She wasn't waiting for courage. She was waiting for timing, and beneath the fear, she carried the dignity of someone who had been tested before and refused to break now. The takeover was complete once the cockpit door stayed shut and the captain's voice never returned. The aircraft flew on, steady and indifferent. The cabin became a controlled cage. Viktor Kovac walked the aisle like he owned the sky. Tomas Vargas followed, scanning faces with technical precision. Eli Novak moved like a contained storm, snapping at cries, kicking bags loose, reminding everyone how fragile they were. A rhythm formed. Silence. A barked command. Stillness. A calm threat that promised follow-through. Phones were taken next. When one teenager tried to hide his, Novak smashed it into the armrest. The cracking glass sounded like a gunshot without the mercy of echo. Mara moved through the chaos, distributing water, calming voices, giving people something to do with their fear. Linda followed at a distance, using the cart as a shield when she could. Viktor watched Mara constantly. Every pause, every crouch, every placement of her feet. Cole watched, hating the helplessness. Knowing exactly where panic could lead, plans began to whisper through the cabin. Mara sensed it immediately. Asterisk. Storms in confined spaces killed more people than they saved. Viktor announced demands no one believed. What he really claimed was time. Then he changed the rules. He pointed to a pregnant woman, Emily Carter, with a small boy pressed against her sleeve. Novak yanked her into the aisle. Owen cried out. The cabin inhaled as one. Mara stepped forward first, hands open, voice soft. She offered herself instead. Novak laughed. She stayed close. Close enough to limit his weapon? Close enough to matter at the exact moment the aircraft shifted. Her elbow brushed his wrist. It looked like an accident. It wasn't single quotes. Timley was seated again, before Novak understood what he'd lost. Viktor did. His warning came quietly. Mara nodded. Submissive on the surface. Inside, the blade edge sharpened. Cole knew it. So did Viktor. The cabin would never return to stillness. And as the aircraft dipped again barely, noticeable to seasoned travelers, Mara adjusted her stance before the motion finished. Not dramatic, just ready. She didn't reach for a seat or brace against the bulkhead. Her feet widened by a fraction, knees softening. Weight settling into balance like someone who had learned long ago how aircraft moved through air. The recognition hit Cole Barrett low and slow. He'd seen that adjustment countless times. In briefing rooms, in cockpits. Pilots did it without thinking, bodies tuned to pitch and yaw the way sailors read waves. Civilians reacted after the movement. Pilots moved with it. Mara moved with it. She kept walking. Water bottles steady in her hands, her head never snapping toward the windows. Instead, her gaze lifted briefly to the overhead panel knot, searching for reassurance, but listening as if the aircraft itself were speaking. Another correction followed, sharper this time. Overhead bins rattled. Someone muttered a curse. Mara's hand rose instinctively, palm open, signaling calm to the row she passed. Her voice stayed even as she told them it was only light turbulence and to keep their seatbelts fastened. The words were ordinary. The timing wasn't. Cole watched her mouth a silent count. 1, 2, 3. The same cadence pilots use when riding instability. Waiting for the aircraft to return to its envelope, Dr. Nathan Brooks noticed it too, though he couldn't have explained why at first. He was trained to recognize decisiveness under stress, to know when calm was competence rather than denial. As a trauma surgeon, he lived in moments where hesitation killed faster than blood loss. When the man Novak had slammed earlier began to wheeze, Brooks knelt to assess him. Mara was already there. She didn't hover or ask permission. She checked airway, posture, and responsiveness with quick, precise motions. Then told Brooks exactly what she needed: seat back up, chin lifted, slow breaths, without raising her voice. There was no uncertainty in her tone. Brooks followed her lead automatically. Only afterward did he realize what had happened. She hadn't deferred. She had directed like someone accustomed to being obeyed in emergencies. Linda Moore stood a few steps away, pretending to adjust the galley curtain. She watched Mara's hands, purposeful, economical, never shaking. When Viktor ordered a check-in with the cockpit, Mara was sent forward to relay the demand. She stopped just outside the reinforced door and lifted the emergency handset. Her posture changed subtly. Shoulders squared. Spine aligned, as if she'd stepped into a different role. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clipped. No pleas. No apologies. No filler. She identified the situation, relayed the demand, and requested confirmation using phrasing Linda had never heard from civilian crew. Say again? Stand by. Chill ran up Linda's arms. Flight attendants were trained to soften edges, to de-escalate, to wrap authority in courtesy. Mara spoke for clarity, not comfort. When the response crackled back, Mara listened without interruption. She nodded once, replaced the handset, and turned. Viktor was watching her from the aisle, his head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing not in anger, but evaluation. He had been around disciplined people before. He recognized the sound of it, the way emotion was stripped down to essentials. He stepped closer, invading her space. Testing for reaction, Mara lowered her gaze again, letting her shoulders slope, letting the illusion settle back into place. But Viktor didn't step away. Cole felt the tension shift. The hijackers had expected pleading, chaos, panic. What they hadn't expected was quiet competence moving through their cage without permission. Another change in pitch rippled through the cabin, more pronounced this time. People cried out. Someone shouted to war at the front, demanding answers no one could give. Mara's hand rose again, steady, her eyes tracking the motion before it finished. She braced, adjusted, then relaxed like someone who trusted the aircraft to do what it was built to do. Cole swallowed hard. He remembered pilots talking about trusting the machine, knowing when to intervene and when to let physics work. Mara carried that trust in her bones. Dr. Brooks leaned closer and whispered to Cole, barely moving his lips, asking if he was seeing what he was seeing. Cole nodded once. Linda caught a fragment as Mara passed the galley again. Mara murmured something about timing and altitude under her breath. Not fear. Analysis. Linda's pulse spiked. She had trained hundreds of attendants. She knew every form of nervousness. This was none of them. Viktor's certainty hardened into something darker. He watched Mara with a predator's patience, letting the cabin breathe just enough to see what else might surface. He tested her, crowding her space, issuing sharp commands meant to provoke. Mara absorbed it all, letting herself look small, letting herself look unimportant, but she didn't look lost. By now, the audience could feel it. The pieces were scattered but deliberate, the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way fear bent around her instead of through her. The question tightened with every minute. Who was she? Viktor didn't know her name. He didn't know her past. But he knew this with cold clarity. The woman in the flight attendant uniform was trained, and training under pressure was far more dangerous than fear. The galley smelled of spilled coffee and recycled air, a quiet space where sound carried too far. The curtains swayed with the aircraft's movement, hiding the narrow corridor from the cabinon from 200 terrified eyes. Novak grabbed Mara's arm without warning and yanked her back. She let herself stumble. Her shoulder clipped the cart. Her foot caught the floor track. She went with it, gasping softly like a woman past her breaking point to anyone watching. It looked exactly like weakness. Novak shoved her through the curtain and pinned her against the counter, breath hot with adrenaline and cruelty. He told her she was getting brave. He told her brave people got hurt first. Mara kept her eyes down. Her hands rose slowly, palms open. Her breathing sped up just enough to sell fear without surrendering control. She waited. The aircraft rolled slightly, minor correction most passengers never noticed. The cartwheels rattled. Novak shifted his weight, leaning in closer. That was the opening. Mara moved in one clean, silent sequence. Her hand snapped up, not striking but redirecting. She trapped Novak's wrist and elbow, twisted them across his center line, and stepped through the space he gave her without realizing it. His weapon hand pinned, his shoulder locked, his balance gone. She didn't slam him. She didn't throw him. She dismantled him. Novak made a sound surprise, trying to become anger, but it never finished forming. Mara drove her forearm into the nerve cluster beneath his jaw with controlled pressure, just enough to shut him down without noise. He sagged. She guided him to the floor, protecting his head from the metal. She didn't look at him again. She was already moving when Tomas Varga pushed through the curtain. Weapon raised. He took in the scene instantly. 2 men down. No shouting. No chaos. He adjusted. Mara saw it immediately, the shift from intimidation to engagement. Disciplined, careful, dangerous in a different way. She raised her hands again, backing up, letting him believe he still controlled the moment. Her eyes flicked once, calculating angles, distances. Lines of fire. Varga advanced, muzzle steady, finger light on the trigger. Mara waited until he fully committed. When the aircraft jolted again, she dropped low, using the motion to mask her movement. Varga fired. The shot tore into the galley wall where her head had been a fraction of a second earlier. The sound was deafening. Mara surged forward under the rifle, drove her shoulder into his chest, slammed him into the bulkhead. She trapped the weapon, twisted it free as her knee collapsed his stance. Varga fought to recover, but she stayed inside his reach. Her size became a liability. She finished it fast, a sharp strike, a controlled choke. Just long enough, Varga slumped beside Novak. Alive but neutralized, Mara stood still for half a second. Listening footsteps. Viktor Kovac pushed through the curtain, weapon already raised. He absorbed the scene without surprise. 2 men down. The flight attendant, standing different now, no longer slumped. No longer small, her eyes were steady, focused, unafraid. Viktor smiled slowly and told her she should have run. Mara didn't answer. She was already calculating distance. Angles, his trigger discipline. She knew she couldn't close before he fired, so she changed the equation. Her hand dropped toward the counter, brushing the open medical pouch she had unzipped earlier. Viktor tracked it instantly and fired. The shot went wide as Mara twisted. She rolled behind the cart, came up with the injector primed. Viktor fired again, grazing her arm. Pain flared. She didn't slow. She drove forward through smoke and noise and plunged the injector into his thigh. Fast-acting, additive. Measured dose. Viktor struck her hard with the weapon, but stars exploded across her vision, but she stayed upright. Counting .1, 2. Viktor staggered. 3. His gun slipped, for he collapsed. Mara caught him, lowering him to the floor with the same care she'd shown the others. She kicked the weapon away, restrained all 3 with practiced speed, then pushed through the curtain without looking back. The cabin froze when she emerged. Smoke lingered. The engines, MC, made Mara move toward the cockpit now without disguise, stride purposeful, authority unmistakable. Linda caught her face as she passed and felt certainty settle. This wasn't panic. This was command. Mara pounded once on the cockpit door, identified herself, and stepped inside the moment it opened. Neutralizing the threat had never been the end. Flying the plane home was,